Welcome everyone to Brain Northwest programming today. We have our wonderful instructor Katarina Turner with us again, which is always a treat. And she's going to be talking about the topic of living under one roof with a kind of multi-generational housing, a variety of living scenarios that cause us to come together, whether that's a change um, in what socioeconomic, medical, or just the desire to live together. It can sometimes be challenging and does require some attention. So I'm really grateful for her guidance in this. Um, and we've had the privilege of having her teach many classes. So please enjoy. I will be keeping an eye on the chat. And um, we will turn off the recording at the end so that we can just talk freely and privately amongst ourselves. But I'm really thankful for this topic. And Katarina, your guidance in these unique and important topics is really valuable. So thank you again for being here. And I look forward to learning alongside all of you. Again, my name is Reggie. Sorry, I didn't mention that. Thank you all.
Thank you, Reggie, and hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see some familiar faces here. Oh, can you hear me now? Sorry.
We can hear you, Katarina.
All right. Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Good to see you.
Yes, good to see you. So over the next 40 minutes or so, like Reggie had previously mentioned, I do like to leave some time at the end if you guys do have any questions or if anything arose for you. So about 40 minutes. We're going to look at what it takes to share a home well across generations and what shifts perhaps when brain injury enters the picture. So I did develop this class intentionally for survivors, for partners, family members who share a home with them, and for anyone else stepping into or supporting this kind of arrangement. So Reggie did a really great job of kind of welcoming this space. And so I'm just going to keep on moving. All right, so the three agreements for our time together will be confidentiality, gentleness, and of course, the right to listen. And again, Reggie hit on this earlier. So just another reiteration. As mentioned, after the class will stop recording, the floor will open up. So do feel free to share your thoughts there. And of course, if you have nothing to say, that is also completely okay too. So before we get into numbers, one thing is worth noting first. Again, this class is written for households where brain injury is a part of the picture. So survivors, partners, adult children, parents, siblings, and anyone else carrying on daily life under the same roof. The tools that we're going to cover today are broad because every situation is unique. And my hope is that they can be applied across the full range of households. The household you're in might be family you're close to or family you're working on being close to, depending upon dynamics. It might be chosen family, like a friend, a partner's parent, or someone who became family simply through circumstance. I do recognize the weight that some homes do carry estrangement, or perhaps you're working on developing that connection again. Some of which might have a paid caregiver or a live-in provider as part of their daily fabric, or blended families. I can go on and on about the different families. We'll be here all day long. But just know that, I'm very aware of the different nuances and variances that each family holds, and there is no one size fits all. Every blueprint is different, and every household carries its own shape. So just taking a look here at the slide, here's what the numbers on the slide tell us about the arrangement many families land in. 1 in 4 adults in the United States live in a multi-generational home, and 66 million Americans share a household with people from different generations right now. And this arrangement has actually quadrupled since the 70s. So three forces drive quadrupling. That is a word to say. Housing costs kind of outpacing wages, and especially with the rise of, the cost of living and inflation, which makes pooling resources the most stable path for many families. And for this community specifically, medical realities that quickly reorganize households. So you're thinking long-term illnesses, dementia, other serious health events. And then when a family system absorbs something like this, the old geography of who lives where often rearranges rather quickly. So the point of the data is that separate households model, which make us, well, which we were taught to be seen as normal in adulthood, is a recent, narrow, and almost mostly American experiment. You'll find that, generational households are very common outside of the United States. So this slide names 4 reasons homes come together across generations that Reggie had touched on previously, whether care, healing, finances, and connection. Most multi-generational households carry 1 or 2 of these, but households with brain injury often carry all 4. Because the demands that follow a brain injury frequently exceed what one person or one nuclear household can sustain alone. Healing, because TBI recovery operates on its own timeline and is unique to the individual, the mechanism of injury, and so on. So, your nervous system is still rebuilding long after the visible wounds have closed. Sorry if you hear my doggo in the background. I'm having people walk in my house. 'Tis life. So another reason is finances, because even with good insurance, the cost of care, specialists, therapies, equipment, lost wages, or perhaps even reduced earning capacity can outpace what any one household can absorb. And then last but not least is connection, because survivors and partners both need people close. And what phone call check-ins used to, do, it's no longer sustainable. The check-ins don't really carry the weight of the care that's needed or the attention that's needed after. So in many households carrying this many load paths at once, different people under the same roof may assume that the arrangement came together for different reasons. So a home organized around care runs its day around the person being cared for, while a home organized around finances would track dollars and contributions. And then a home around, say, connection would protect shared time and presence. So these look similar from the outside, but they produce very different daily rhythms and very different expectations about what the household owes each person. When one person in the home thinks I moved in solely for care, and another assumes it's about finances, the friction that shows up often traces back kind of to that unspoken mismatch rather than to whatever surface issue is being argued over. So the question worth carrying out of this slide is, which of the 4 is your reason? It's whether everyone under the roof thinks it's the same one. So this is a rather large percentage. 79% of multi-generational families report stronger bonds because of their family structure. And that phrase, stronger bonds, is worth unpacking. So families aren't being asked whether they love each other more. This data, specifically this number, was pulled from behavioral data. So how quickly the household responds to crisis, how quickly financial stress is absorbed, and then whether older adults show better health outcomes and whether children show stronger emotional regulation. So the mechanism comes down to 2 things: proximity and reciprocity. Proximity means the household is close enough to act before a situation escalates. And then reciprocity means everyone contributes something. And in a household that is impacted by injury, that tends to get tested often. So when a survivor contributes may look nothing like what they contributed before, their contribution is presence or perspective, humor or patience. A partner's contribution may have shifted from equal footing collaboration or into care or advocacy. Reciprocity, I want you to think of, is a felt sense. So in every person under the roof, that they give as well as receive. And when that reciprocity is present, even in homes running on empty, the bonds strengthen. When one person drifts into giving only and another into receiving only, the bonds may feel weakened. So that 79% holds even in households describing that the arrangement is hard. Yeah, it's hard, but we're still toughing it out. The bonds are stronger anyway if reciprocity is alive in some form. So really the rest of this class is going to be asking specifically how to keep reciprocity alive, how to distribute the load so no one in the house is only receiving or only giving, and how to design a shared life that holds up under new circumstances. Or perhaps if they're not new circumstances, how to improve the current situation. When a new living arrangement begins, especially one shaped by injury, there's often a feeling that neither person can quite put into words. As a survivor, you may carry grief for their pre-injury life. The partner or the family member carries grief for maybe a relationship that they had, or the independence that each person held, and maybe the life that you had imagined unfolding a little differently. Ambiguous loss is grief without a clear ending, and it doesn't resolve. And because the person you're grieving is still there, just the circumstances have changed. But it's really important to understand this word because it kind of gives a name to that feeling. And for survivors, again, it could be the grief of the version of yourself that maybe existed before, or maybe you find yourself unchanged and you're like, Katerina, I'm still completely, me. So maybe this may be relevant to you or not. And again, if this is irrelevant, don't take it. If it is, hold it to be true. But both are real and both can be happening at the same time without either person having said a word about it. So the term itself is a tool, and then having the language is doing most of the legwork. So in a lot of my trainings, I talk about both and. So you're probably like, man, Katerina, both and is always coming up because it is so very important. So both and sounds simple enough that it can come across as a platitude. So I just want to make a case for why it's harder than it looks and why it's necessary in a TBI household. Either or thinking is durable because it's cognitively cheap. We prefer black and white. The brain prefers resolution. So binary categories like good or bad or working, not working, grateful or resentful, kind of let the nervous system settle into a stable answer so it can move on. And ambiguity remains open and requires continuous holding, which demands more effort onto the brain. So the cost of that efficiency is that experience rarely sorts itself into binaries, and brain injury experience almost never does. So when we force an experience into either or, the parts that don't fit don't disappear. They become kind of like these quiet resentments or maybe even small confusions as to, am I failing at these feelings or, should I be able to resolve them? And both and feels uncomfortable in a way because it refuses to have that resolution. So holding, I'm exhausted and I love this home. I love my partner, but man, I'm feeling really just out of touch with him right now. It can be both. And every time you notice yourself reaching for an either or conclusion, pause and add an and in the middle of the sentence to open the sentence back up to the truth. It doesn't necessarily have to be black and white, and it can be both. So when you're living in a household, again, with one of our variances, partner, parent, child, the four roles shift. They're pretty common in multi-generational homes, and they become especially pronounced, again, when injury is in the household. So what I want to draw your attention to is that almost always they happen in silence. And this isn't something to where I say, spouse, it feels like my role has shifted. We kind of just slide into this new way of life and hit the ground running. And most families don't have that social script for naming a change in the role. If you think about it, we have rituals for birthdays and anniversaries and deaths and graduations, but we don't really have anything for the way we used to share this decision has shifted, and we haven't talked about it, especially with big life changes. So the roles quietly move, And on every side, different feelings continue to accumulate. So a survivor may take on new work too. So that may look like learning to advocate for yourself in a medical setting or building new ways to communicate your energy and capacity and rebuilding parts of your life on different terms in a shared space, because that's hard when you're losing that privacy. Perhaps you used to live on your own and then now you're getting used to, sharing a room or listening to someone snore in the middle of the night. And then also conversely, a partner or family member picks up coordination or care work that maybe wasn't there before. So a parent who thought that they were going to be an empty nester, maybe they're back into their caregiving chapter. Everyone's role shifts and then it's not really discussed. So picture a household into life after a brain injury. Their survivor is doing the real work. So, rehab, self-advocacy, rebuilding those routines. That family doesn't always see it because it's internal. It's just kind of a part of the new routine. Meanwhile, again, the partner has picked up that medical coordination. And in a year, you guys are burnt out. You're exhausted. And then when something small surfaces, whose turn it is to unload the dishwasher, the real cause stays under the water, but the work has been invisible to the other person, and the silence is what begins to strain the house. So the solution isn't to prevent the role shift. Shifts are absolutely going to be inevitable, and a household is going to move through recovery and change. But the solution is going to be to build a house where naming the shift out loud becomes the norm, to where you can have these open conversations without feeling those tiny resentments or, hey, do you mind closing your door so I don't hear you snoring? It doesn't have to be big things, but just small conversations that should be had. So every person in a home needs three things to feel like themselves: to feel like you're living your own life and not just existing inside of this new version that is no longer your home. You want to have your choices that still feel like your own, and a sense that the things that you do still matter, and a sense of being connected and seen as a whole person rather than a role. So this is research calls autonomy, competence, and belonging. And decades of work across cultures and populations show that when one of them goes missing, people stop thriving, no matter how much love is around them. So the people who love their survivor start managing their lives because the tasks are there and someone has to do them. And then perhaps over time, that management starts to edge out of their survivor's sense of choice. So that looks like doing things for them, edging out their sense of capability. And then when every conversation becomes logistics, so, talking about medications and appointments and, scheduling, that connection between the people in the house starts to feel thin and worn out on both sides. And not that it's anyone's fault. Most of it is invisible while it's happening, which is why it's often not noticed until the relationship feels strained. You feel that stress and you feel like, man, is this going to continue to work? But the good news is that once you see the pattern, it's really easy to change. It's just, a matter of having a conversation or learning to develop the skills to have the conversations. So I just want to touch briefly here on dignity of risk. And it shows up around choices. So think about, I like to use the example of driving. So for a lot of survivors, the question of driving again is one of the biggest in recovery, or at least in my case management experience. It's not so much about transportation. It was always about independence and identity and adulthood, and the ability to go somewhere and be your own person without having to ask for that permission. And for the partner or loved one, it's scary, especially if it is a new injury. Brain injury can affect vision or your reaction time. So to them, the stakes are really high. So I just want you to picture a household where, their survivor has been cleared. The doctor said you're good to go. They feel ready and their partner still isn't ready. So every time the survivor picks up the keys, the partner finds a reason to drive instead. And that could look like, you had a really long day. I've got it. Just, I'll take it. You rest. And you don't push back, but, months continue to go by and you still haven't driven. And the longer it goes, the harder it is to get behind that wheel again. So overprotection, however loving, can quietly take a person's dignity. And I say this as a mom. I say it as the spouse. It's hard, and you want to step in, but sometimes you just have to take a moment and step back, and you can ask yourself these questions. Is the risk understood? Does the individual have a clear-eyed view of what could go wrong? Is it proportionate? Is the risk in line with what other drivers take every day? Or is it repairable? If something goes wrong, can the family recover from it? For most clear drivers, all three are yes, which means the most respectful answer is to hand over the keys and, let them take charge. If the answer is no, if you haven't been cleared, and again, this is a broad generalization. Of course, we're talking about living in a household. I'm just giving you an example here. The explanation preserves dignity even when the answer is no. So in a household where you're sharing, if this is a new situation, something that you can do as a caregiver or a loved one, if this is a new arrangement for you, is to design a home that respects how the individual's brain works best. So, a calmer sensory environment, a predictable rhythm or slower pace of conversation, shared external memory like a family calendar can really help do a lot of the legwork that may prevent some of the conversations that cause friction later on down the road. As a partner, if you are carrying a lot of cognitive load, it makes everything easier if you just have a shared calendar. A stressed family member finds a quiet room useful too. So these are just some sample accommodations that you can help to help design your home and make it more livable for everyone inside, with the added benefit of supporting recovery. So again, this is kind of that dual track reality. Something that doesn't usually belong in the same sentence often ends up living side by side, and that's the grief and growth. So we just spent some time in the grief place, ambiguous loss, the weight that settles in after change. But then what sits on the other track is something called post-traumatic growth. And I always want to be careful when I describe this because it gets misread. And it's most certainly not a silver lining. And it is not the idea that an injury was secretly a gift or that everything happens for a reason, because that's not what I'm saying. Post-traumatic growth describes a meaningful portion of brain injury survivors is that certain parts of life shift in unexpected ways after their trauma. So that may look like relationships deepening or your priorities becoming clearer. People discover these strengths that they didn't know that they had. So none of that erases a loss. It just lives alongside of it. And that's the hard part to hold because a survivor can be quietly rebuilding something meaningful in their life, like adjusting to a new living situation. But sometimes in the same afternoon, the mind wants the story to land in one direction, and this one simply does not. So making space for connection. If grief and growth are both living in a home at the same time, the question then becomes, what keeps the home feeling like a good place to be? What makes a household feel warm and inviting and steady and a safe space? So there's a piece of research that answers the question that I've come across, and it's from John Gottman's Love Lab at the University of Washington, where his team had studied, couples for more than 40 years, bringing them into a small studio apartment, tracking pulse, facial expressions, the whole shebang. And then the prediction accuracy his team achieved from a single observed conversation, which was around 94%, was the strongest predictor they found was a ratio, 5-1. So having 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative one. That doesn't mean that the 5 positive interactions erase the negative one. That's not it at all. But that's what the healthiest relationships run on. Most people assume a healthy relationship requires big gestures. So big positive inputs to balance out the negative ones, romantic weekends or a grand gesture or a major repair after a fight. But what Gottman found is that the frequency beats the magnitude. The nervous system doesn't distinguish small positive inputs from the large ones. It counts them. So 5 small warm moments over the course of a day register as a much safer environment than 1 grand gesture over the course of a month. And the good news for a shared household is because grand gestures are often out of reach or too expensive or exhausting or just unrealistic, what the ratio asks for is frequency. And that's something that's doable on any given Tuesday. And it could be something as small as a cup of coffee or, a small gratitude said out loud. So the question that comes next would be, okay, how? How a household actually builds the 5-to-1 ratio on a Tuesday when I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and I don't have time, and I don't even have time to make myself a cup of coffee, let alone you a cup of coffee. So the honest answer is that relying on willpower to generate these warm moments doesn't really work because willpower is the first resource to run out in a stressful situation. So that's why you really want to help developing these rituals. So rather than walking through the 5 anchors on the slide one by one, I want to explain why ritual as a design choice is load-bearing in a household, because once that's clear, it just becomes habit. So first, predictability reduces cognitive load, and a healing brain spends much of its resources on prediction. What's happening next? What's coming? And these rituals pre-answer those questions so the brain can settle into a pattern of constantly scanning for the next demand. And then second, ritual automatically builds the 5-to-1 ratio without requiring anyone to remember or to try. So if that morning coffee ritual is already built into place, a warm moment has already been banked before anyone decides to warm on purpose. So that ratio is already being built into the day itself, rather than depending on someone having the energy to show up for it. And lastly, ritual creates micro transitions. So a household absorbs a lot of small shifts over the small course of the day, whether that's changes in energy or mood or news from the outside or rituals, they give those shifts somewhere to land. So rituals also carry a household through the ordinary parts of the day, but every home also has conversations that routine cannot carry, and those are the hard ones, where something needs to be said that perhaps has not been said. So the 2 versions of the sentence on the slide produce completely different outcomes in a real kitchen, and the reason isn't stylistic. Gottman's team calls the first version a harsh startup. And they found that in the first 3 minutes of a disagreement, couples' nervous systems decide whether they're under attack. And that decision happens faster when the brain processes the actual words. So by the time the listener understands what's being asked, their body is already in a hyper defensive state. They don't hear anything that's coming out of your mouth. But once the nervous system is in defense, the cortex, the part of the brain that handles language or problem solving, just kind of starts to go offline. So you can have a reasonable request and a person who loves you, and the conversation will still fail because your physiology has already decided you're done. So this matters especially in brain injury households, as survivors' nervous systems are already you're running closer to a threshold on any given day. Which means a harsh startup might have been absorbable, but now the whole conversation over the edge is over the edge before it begins. And the 3 moves are designed to keep the listener's nervous system out of defense long enough for the actual words to land. So speaking from I rather than you kind of removes that cue to attack. So naming what you feel rather than what they did wrong can remove the cue of accusation as well. So asking for something specific rather than a change of heart gives the brain a solvable problem, and that solvable problem can help deactivate that threat while unsolvable ones activate it. Okay, so even with the best opening, some hard conversations still escalate past what either person can hold in that moment. So what you need for those moments is an exit. And that exit is not an exit from the relationship or the house. That exit is going to come up in a more stealthy way. So the scripts on this slide are useful, but the most important piece of the information on the slide is tucked into a single short phrase, the exact time. So what a conversation escalates beyond capacity, again, both people's nervous systems are activated. And when that physiological arousal, exceeds a certain threshold, it should take about 20 minutes for your body to return to that baseline. So less than that, and the person is still flooded to have a productive conversation. Just really being mindful of stepping away isn't an escape from the relationship. It's an act of commitment to it. And it says, I'm leaving the room to protect this conversation and I'll return at a specific time. That's a really effective tool rather than just walking away, if things are getting heated, because you might feel abandoned, or the other person might feel abandoned. And you may not see it as abandonment, but without saying, Katerina, I need 5 minutes to clear my head, to step away. That gives the person time to process and come back and to have a conversation when you're both in the right space to have that conversation. And here are some everyday pocket scripts. And, not every hard moment needs that 20-minute pause. Most of them just need a phrase or two and something short and ready so you don't have to invent language when you're already under stress. The pattern is short words, a specific task, and a kind frame. So short words because escalation tolerates only a few syllables before it takes over. And any script longer than about 15 words, usually you'll forget, or I know I would forget. So just having a really quick go-to, a specific ask, because vague asks like, gosh, I just wish you would care more, or be kinder, give the listener nothing to say yes to, while solvable asks tend to de-escalate. So, I need some quiet time. Can we talk about this in an hour? Or I notice I've been feeling really stressed out when you snore. For those who snore, I'm so sorry, I'm harping on the snoring. But these are just some simple tasks that you can, or simple scripts that you can have. And the other reason pre-written scripts matter is simpler. They remove the cognitive load of inventing the language while you're in that activated state. So where the baseline stress level is already higher, you can bypass that into just something that is calming and your go-to to de-escalate. So even when we have the right scripts, and I have the right scripts in my back pocket, and sometimes I don't use those scripts. So it's nice in theory. But even with the right scripts and the right openings, sometimes fights continue to happen. And the argument tends to come in different costumes that might blow up over something small that doesn't seem small in that moment. And that's usually a sign that the fight isn't really about what it looks like. So on this slide, you can see 4 different categories that typically lie beneath household arguments. What it doesn't teach is how to notice in real time that you're fighting about the waterline rather than the surface. So the signal to watch out for is disproportion. Is there a mismatch between the intensity of the feeling and the subject? If an argument about the unloaded dishwasher is producing 10 out of 10 emotional intensity, the dishwasher isn't the issue. The intensity is accurate, that it is just a decoy. So in your household, disproportion shows up more often than in most homes, perhaps because all 4 of the categories on this slide, unspoken expectations, decision fatigue, Different rhythms and old patterns run hotter under the weight of recovery. Decision fatigue alone can account for an enormous amount of household friction and family fielding medical appointments, insurance calls, and just daily coordination of just life in and of itself. So when you catch that disproportionate reaction in yourself or even in someone else, the question to pull out of your pocket is, what am I actually fighting about? Don't ask it in the fight. That's not going to do any good. And you can't. Ask it afterward, once you've cooled down, and be willing to sit with the answer. The answer usually maps to one of the four categories, either the unspoken expectation, decision fatigue, different rhythms, or old patterns. It's just going to be a matter of naming what's underneath. What makes the surface argument solvable? And without that naming, you'll find that the same fight will continue to reoccur, just in different costumes. And this slide speaks directly to two people in the household, most of which each one needs is already on the screen, but I just wanted to add a little bit of framing that the slide points out without fully developing. To the person living with a brain injury, naming your needs is leadership in the household. You are by no means a burden at all. So just naming what it is that you need. The people who you love are guessing and they're watching for cues and they're trying to interpret small signals. And usually they may get it wrong. So when you name what you need directly, you're not asking them for more. You're deciding what you need and you're deciding how to have those needs met. So even if it's something as simple as, I really need my alone time, in the evening. I love having you around, spouse or friend or, whoever it is, but I really need 2 hours of the day to just have to myself or, to not be around people. So just naming that need. And then to the partner, family member, or whoever has stepped into that caregiving role, watch for what I would call the burnout to resentment pipeline. Resentment doesn't really happen overnight. It happens gradually, as you skip your own rest and then you kind of miss out on going out with your friends, or, you take on this role. And sometimes the role that you take on isn't the need. So again, that disproportionate caregiving to where you're stepping into a place that may not be warranted. That higher level of care that you think needs to happen all the time may not be warranted. You do have to take time for yourself and take time for self-care. So just really being mindful of that and catching that pipeline is so important. So if you notice that tenderness starting to feel tight, or that you need a moment to rest before tightness becomes that resentment, it's much harder to walk back to. And the same wisdom applies to every seat in this house. Just take the time for yourself and name what you need, and take time for self-care. So 4 questions to sit with. Do each of us have room to make our own choices? Do we see each other's capabilities or mostly each other's needs? When was the last time we connected outside of care or logistics? And what is one thing we haven't said out loud that probably should be said? And the first 3 of these maps directly onto the 3 load-bearing walls from earlier: autonomy, competence, and belonging. And the 4 is honesty check that keeps the other 3 from calcifying over time. Okay, so now we have come to the household agreement. And the research finding on this slide, the household that writes their agreement down fight about the same thing significantly less often has a specific mechanism worth understanding. So when an agreement lives only in your memory, it has 2 versions: your version and their version. And over time, those versions are definitely going to drift apart. They're going to change the narrative. They're going to just completely reconstruct themselves, just based on the fact that our memories are not the best historians and they tend to work in our own favor. We tend to remember the version of an agreement that was the most convenient for us. When the agreement gets tested by, say, a holiday or a financial strain or a medical crisis, those two versions will collide. So the fight that follows is about the current situation, but it's actually about the two drifting memories. And this is particularly acute in households, again, affected by brain injury, where the memory itself may be in repair. And expecting a survivor to remember a verbal agreement from 6 months ago is not realistic. And even for myself, who has not experienced a TBI, I would not be able to remember an agreement that I made with someone 6 months ago. So expecting a partner to hold the weight of that daily coordination of that agreement to remember, it's unrealistic. So writing the agreement down externalizes it, and then the disagreement becomes a document problem rather than a memory problem. So instead of you said versus I said, there's a line on a page that can be read and revised together. So I know it sounds really formal to have a document for your home, but if you're coming up with different things, different friction points, you want to get something down in writing of, I really need my space at this time, or, whatever the friction point may be for you, just taking the time to acknowledge it, write it down, and come up with a solution. The calm version of the household should be writing the plan, not the tired version or when you guys are in an active argument. It's definitely not going to be the right time to negotiate. So here are some different values that you can consider when writing a household agreement blueprint. I know 10 sections feels like a lot, and I'm sure that you could probably come up with more, or maybe you only need one of these. The first 5, shared values, money, visible and invisible workspace, privacy, guest, are pretty structural. So they describe the basic architecture of how the household operates, who contributes what, how space is used, and how resources flow. The second 5, health, autonomy, big decisions, repair, and revision, are more relational and adaptive. They describe how the household responds to change, how medical events are handled, how individual choice is protected, and then also how decisions are made together. And most importantly, how the household recovers from conflict and how the document itself stays alive as life shifts. This should absolutely be a living document that continues to be edited and revised, as time goes on. And like I mentioned, most households, you don't need all 10. You might need 1 or 2 or 3, or you might need none. Maybe a written document is not for you. Health and repair are often the first 2 worth writing down because they tend to be where the most unspoken assumptions have accumulated. The conversation is exhausting. Even looking at this is exhausting to think about, breaking down shared values and even big decisions. When are you in the right headspace to have these conversations? So just one section, one sitting, and then stop. These are not things that you really want to blow through, especially when it comes to big decisions and health. Sorry, got ahead of myself. So when you're needing more than this class, here are some different resources. And while discussing multi-generational living in a so far 48-minute class, I'm so very sorry, Reggie. I'm very long-winded today. So while, I can try to cover as much as I can, it's such a conversation. Like I said, it's as unique as a TBI, your family and your family structure and the dynamics. So if you're feeling like, Katerina, I'm at a point where perhaps a blueprint is not going to cut it, rope in some community, have someone sit down and talk about those variances or maybe different strategies that you can use to maintain your peace and your privacy and just keep life rolling smoothly. And again, here's, if you're wanting to design your first section, really thinking about, who the people are, designing it to fit it into a single short conversation at a kitchen table. And then what works is picking the smallest version that you can execute within 7 days, whenever you feel like starting. And then lastly is continuing the journey. So here are some different books and memoirs specifically for caregiving or just TBI in general. And again, Reggie will be sending these out to you, I do believe, after the class, so I'm happy to send it over in a PDF version if that's more helpful. But that is it for me today, and I am so very grateful for you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Katerina.
Thank you
you.
so much, Katerina. I'm going to stop the recording and then we can chat. That was just so lovely and also like so insightful and enlightening. So let me just close here.